Okay, let's start. Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoomina from UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schede, professor here at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. Today is April 29th, 2025 in California, which makes it April 30th in Japan. Happy Golden Week, everybody, and Ohayo gozaimasu to Japan. Before I introduce our speaker today, that you, of course, know because you signed up for it, let me just tell you a little bit about our school. So this finds you at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We have more than 46 core faculty. We actually just hired a Japan economist, and I'm quite excited about that. 8 degrees, including a Master of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our degrees and what we do, please go to gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center. It stands for Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology, and we're having a lot of fun out here. You can follow us at jfit.ucsd.edu. Our events were recorded, and the recordings are also at that website, jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar. The recordings have two implications. The first is we're asking you to type any questions you may have into the Q&A box and to make sure that your privacy is secured. I will not refer to your name unless you type in ID me so that I can say our colleague Joe says this. Otherwise, I won't do that, and I won't use your last name at all. On the good news side, the recordings mean we have a gallery called the JZ Gallery, and you can find all of our past events at jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar. All right, and with that, let me introduce Professor Gennifer Weisenfeld, and there she is. Hey, Gennifer. Hello in Durham, I guess, is where you are. So you're joining me from the East Coast and giving up dinner for this, so that's very nice. So Gennifer Weisenfeld is the Walter H. Annenberg Distinguished Professor of Art and Art History at Duke University. And I just learned, originally hails from Brooklyn and stayed on the East Coast the entire time, I guess. BA from Wesleyan and then MA and PhD from Princeton. I looked at your publication record, Gennifer, and I could just eat up 10 minutes of our time here today and reading all of that out. But let me point out that there are 3 recent books. You've been exceedingly productive. The one that we're going to talk about today is, of course, this one, and it's absolutely fabulous. The Fine Art of Persuasion. Previous to that, you wrote in 2024, The Complete Commercial Artist, Making Modern Design in Japan, 1928 to 1930. And before that, the very famous and, really, I mean, it starts with a cover, The Gas Mask Nation, Visualizing Civil Air Defense in Wartime Japan. There are lots of papers and books and chapters. I will advise the audience, if they don't know about you, they should go to your website at Duke because they're all listed there. So, Gennifer, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Ulrika. It's so wonderful to be here with you and everyone in the audience. And I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that.
Perfect.
Okay, wonderful. And I look forward to questions from the audience. I know you have a lot of people here who are interested in business and economics. I'm an art historian and a scholar of visual and media studies, but certainly there's a lot of economics and business history here. I thought I might just start by talking about the genesis of this book project. And you mentioned my earlier works, and one of my earliest works was on the Japanese avant-garde of the 1920s and the group MAVO that you see here on the cover of the book. And through this work, I became very interested in how and why young Japanese artists who were trained in fine art, particularly international modernism, were starting to work for Japanese corporations selling new consumer products. And one particular design competition that these artists participated in was to redesign the packaging for Kao soap in 1930. So it really all started with a bar of soap. And Kao held this competition to redesign its packaging and ultimately selected the bold red design that you see on the screen here by now renowned designer Hara Hiromu. And I was already familiar with Hara Hiromu. He is considered a titan in the post-war design field, and he was also a major designer for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. But I quickly learned that he was already working for companies from the mid to late 1920s for new corporate sponsors. He was also actively publishing on modernist experimental typography. He was teaching new printing technologies and techniques. And then he was working for the Japanese state from the 1930s through the war and into the post-war period, doing large-scale photomural montages, such as the one you see in the middle of the screen for the 1937 World's Fair in Paris. And then he worked on several prominent multilingual propaganda magazines like Front, which you see at the bottom. And as I mentioned, he was a major designer for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. Like many of these Japanese designers, he lived a long time. And so this becomes a 20th century story. I started looking into the individuals producing commercial art early in the century and the companies that they were working for. And it just opened up an absolutely fascinating story. Ultimately, after doing extensive research over many years in and out of these archives, unexplored corporate archives, certainly unexplored by art historians, the archives revealed the groundbreaking work of a broad network of advertising design specialists. And I felt that it was really imperative to bring this creative advertising design in Japan, commercial art, out from behind closed doors and show how it was not only deeply connected to national and international movements in fine art, hence the title of my book, The Fine Art of Persuasion, but also integral to Japanese culture and social history, as well as economics and politics. So, this book tells the story of the birth of commercial art, modern advertising design in Japan from the turn of the 20th century through its first global peak in the total design event of the 1964 Tokyo Summer Olympic Games. The book broadly analyzes the construction of selected brand identities, everything from eye-catching trademarks to innovative packaging, signboards to show windows, and beyond. Basically, advertising in all forms. And so, an important contribution of the book is addressing advertising commercial art and commercial art as multimodal. That is to say, not just print media. And it's worth noting here that after more than a century in business, all the companies I discuss are still major companies with well-known national and global brands. However, Japan is often left out of global histories of advertising design in the early 20th century, except maybe as a source or inspiration for Japonisme. And art historians will immediately know what that means, but I'm happy to discuss it later. So, the introduction of the book frames the stakes of reinserting Japan back into a global network of modern design producers as an active participant from early in the 20th century, not a latent recipient on the periphery. So, just to start by summarizing some of the big takeaways of the book. First, from the turn of the 20th century, Japanese companies, many new companies with new modern products, were making a serious investment in visual culture. And this was not just about selling goods, but about creating culture, culture that shaped and changed modern daily life. And we can talk about the positive and negative ramifications of this later, but the impact was undeniable. So I argue that the contributions of corporate manufacturers to modern Japanese culture went well beyond economics, fundamentally transforming the very practices of daily life and the visuality of daily life. Therefore, these companies must be considered as innovative and adaptive cultural producers. Um, and their impact was particularly important because corporate aims were often keyed to national and imperial objectives. Hence, again, in the title, Corporate Advertising Design, Nation, and Empire in Modern Japan. In this book, I demonstrate the fluid and interconnected relationship between publicity and propaganda. So when we see a bar of soap, like Call soap, high quality brand name cosmetic soap, while it might While it may have been marketed to clean and improve one's skin, it was also marketed through campaigns that taught rituals of cleanliness and domestic hygiene, like hand washing, to produce a healthier national and imperial subject. And because consumers were often gendered, it also sold the idea of being a better wife and mother for female consumers. This served larger social and political objectives. Another important argument in the book is for a trans-war perspective, and you'll see that the last chapter is called Trans-War Design. Trans-war is a term that I have been championing because it does not see the war as a complete rupture that produced some kind of cultural tabula rasa. And that's despite the horrors of the war and the massive political transformations that the Allies imposed during the occupation and after. I believe that trans-war studies importantly looks for continuities that span from before the war, across the war, and into the post-war period. And this is particularly important for design history because the standard story one hears is that real Japanese design began in the post-war period when individual designers became better known and their work achieved more social status. But the history of modern design in Japan did not suddenly start in the post-war period. So arguing for trans-war continuity is important because we can see the critical foundation of pre-war professional networks that span the century and the continuities in national ideology, corporate sponsorship, and design strategies, which were all, I argue, entangled. Consumer capitalism and national government were entangled, particularly for social mobilization. And I found some very convincing and even startling continuities and convergences by following the careers of many important individuals and networks that spanned the 20th century. So, in the final chapter, I use the Olympics as one dynamic case study to understand the hidden layers of trans war continuity. And I'll discuss that a little bit later. So now to just turn to how the book is structured, you're looking at the table of contents here. I have to admit, I was completely overwhelmed by the amount of material in corporate archives and of the challenges of how to organize it. There were many, many times when I thought, this may just be a book about soap because each company could have been a big book on its own. Each of these companies is fascinating. They existed for over a century. They still exist. There's a lot of information here. But ultimately, I decided that the comparative approach was as important as the full story of each of these companies over all of these decades. And I decided to organize the corporate material based on markets: health and beauty, food and beverage, labor and leisure for electrical goods, and for with two representative companies for each, and then nation and empire, both as product and as market. And the two opening chapters focus on the professionalization of design, how a key network of individuals actively constructed commercial art as a professional field, and then particularly focusing on one modality, which is the design of letter forms, which has a very specific and unique history to Japan. And then my closing chapter is about trans-war design and the post-war period, culminating in 1964. I start the book with this postcard image of the Ginza in the early 1930s because design was embedded in the urban landscape. Commercial areas like the Ginza were design's playground. Design transformed the cityscape into an exposition-like environment with decorative signs everywhere, standalone kiosks and decorative entryways, permanent and temporary. You can just see in this image what urban life looked like on the streets of Ginza in the early 1930s. And then, of course, the nighttime illumination was another kind of advertising spectacle that transformed the city. This was the age of electricity, and light itself was a malleable medium for publicity that changed the urban cityscape. Light was also a commodity, and that's one of the markets that I'll discuss. Advertising design was transforming the streets everywhere. And this was actually a global phenomenon. And on the image on the left, which is actually a cow advertisement, but it shows it's very meta and it shows this self-reflexive aspect of advertising within the city street, showing cow advertising on signposts and various kinds of columns and street signs and various sort of things that you would encounter in a montage, simultaneity, a style of simultaneity. You also, as you see on the right, had a kind of parading publicity through the streets that starts in the mid-19th century, known as chindonia, which were musical groups and parading groups that here, this was for national brand handheld lights, oversized lights that were paraded through the street. So publicity was paraded and performed in the streets. And design and advertising campaigns were often designed to be totalizing environments that enveloped all of the senses. And I mentioned the term multimodal design, and so I'll just give you a few examples of that to flesh that concept out. For instance, mobile publicity. Design was moving through the streets on new modes of transportation. The image you have on the left is a cow delivery truck designed with, decorated with balloons that, of course, reference the bubbles of soap and this whole thematic of reliable sudsing and not one bubble wasted. This is a mobile advertisement that would move through the city. The image on the right is a mock-up for how to do such a truck with placeholder text where senden just means advertising and you have ABC. And I will talk a little bit about some of the publications that created these mock-ups that would allow people, various companies that didn't have dedicated designers to still understand how to create innovative modern design using types of pre-created templates. And of course, transportation included trains and trams and train stations and all of the different ways in which people were moving around the city. Of course, buildings were also modern commercial marquees as well as retail spaces. And I just show you a poster here for the very famous department store Mitsukoshi, which finds its roots back in the 17th century, but in the early 20th century, built these modern, large-scale, new monumental buildings that became important commodity emporiums, but were also a kind of gateway. These buildings became a kind of urban advertisement that drew in new consumers, like this modern woman and her young child here, with people lining up around it as a gateway to the commodity exposition inside. And a whole subgenre of entryways and gateway designs start to appear to entice consumers into stores. This is another design mock-up from an important compendium that was published at the end of the 1920s. That is the compendium that I published that you mentioned earlier, which is a really important, it's a really important publication in terms of codifying and disseminating global design right at that particular moment. And this shows retailers how to create a temporary entryway with placeholder text to put dates for a big sale. And it's a visual marquee and a wayfinder that reaches out to pedestrians in the street and draws them into the store. Show windows were also a really important external enticement to draw pedestrian consumers in. We take this for granted now that because we live among show windows, but this is the moment when show windows are created. The arcades in Paris, and you see Carl Soap creating soap patriotism, an image of the production of soap bars in a show window display, or on the right, Shiseido's famous signature building in Ginza, still there, still in the same location, with its prominent show window in the front where it would trade out commodities. This show window style of displaying goods and commodities connected the outdoor street and the indoor commodity emporium. They were theatrical spaces for staging the commodity, directly showing products to the consumer. They were designed with light and they spectacularized the goods. Again, day and night, the impressions were very different. But design was also a total sensory engagement. It engaged the consumer's body. It engaged the salesperson's body. You have a well-known actress here on the left who is literally wrapped in branded clothing, wearing the cowl garb with her, and imagine her in red. This would have been in red, with the stylish headscarf for a promotional event that was done in conjunction with women's magazines for a department store. And retail spaces like the national brand, a light bulb retail space on the right, shows that this was both an embodied and spatial experience with light as both a commodity. You're seeing those products, the light products, but also as a publicity medium that illuminates the sales space, and always attractive sales girls. Wrapping paper is a very important, long-standing kind of modality, and packaging in general in advertising design. It was often called the silent salesman all the way going back to Tokugawa times, because the consumer continued to reuse the wrapping and promote the brand and the product, even after the goods were used. And this is a little like our carrying around Lululemon bags or branded bags, that we continue to promote the product with the packaging itself and reusing it. And packaging became a promotional medium. It even contained games, and it became collectibles that consumers kept. It became a kind of creative advertising space in and of itself. And I'm just showing you one example of Shiseido's very beautiful wrapping paper here. We must, of course, address the social impact of these commodity enticements, and what it meant to Japanese society to buy these goods. I argue that corporate advertisers advocated for an ethics of virtuous consumption while carefully straddling the line between extravagance and necessity, sort of pleasurable wants and utilitarian needs. And design for advertising and publicity always exists in this kind of ambivalent space. We can say that many people, especially women during this time period, found this world of goods and new lifestyles liberating. They were able to identify as new consumer subjects with new financial power, but were clearly also manipulated, mobilized, reformed, and disciplined by corporate culture and goods. So we have to acknowledge this complexity, and that the aestheticization of commerce is a key part of modernity itself. Japanese social reformers and ideologues certainly worried about excessive, unnecessary consumption as a social problem. But again, a key point of the book is to reveal how companies marketed their brand name commodities as necessary. So, for instance, Morinaga caramels were sweet, but also nutritious. And as anyone who's read my book on Gas Mask Nation knows, they were sold to be included in care packages for soldiers at the front. So again, it's not so clear what is a luxury or an extravagance or a treat, and what is necessary and a staple good and vital in certain ways. It's a little bit more complex than that. But speaking of consumers, it's important to underscore here that most of the companies I discussed were founded just before the turn of the century, and they were manufacturing new commodities and envisioning new kinds of consumers: men, women, and children, the modern family as a whole, and as individuals. And I cannot emphasize enough how important children were as consumer subjects, who now had their own children's culture and desires for goods, especially sweets. And this poster, which I absolutely love, shows the iconic yellow Morinaga caramel box, which is still in use today. You can find it at H Mart or anywhere you buy this. They continue to use it because it is such a symbol of the desire and the yearning for sweets, and this idea of the ensuring pleasurable contents for the consumer. It has this longevity to it. These new companies also created new publicity characters. We certainly know Japan as the center of cute character goods now, but this was a key strategy for brand identity construction early on. Maybe not as many people know the Nikkei woolen clothes figure, the Dekobo, who wears this big woolen sweater and socks. You see Okuyama Gihachiro designing it here on the left. And also the use of contemporary celebrities and sports figures. Sumo wrestlers were very popular during this time, and they often did not smile. So seeing them smile in posters was a real asset and important. Baseball, all these other kinds of modern sportsmen were also really popular during this time. And then on the right, you see a host of movie stars like the famous cross-ethnic actress Ri Koran, who was known for her films about Manchuria and China, and she appears absolutely everywhere in advertisements. In fact, we see the same celebrity working across corporate and national publicity spaces. So here we see the iconic film actress Hara Setsuko, the consummate loyal daughter and sister in Japanese films, in advertisements for Morinaga chocolate, national brand electric fans, and even as the face of hospitality in the Japanese National Pavilion at the New York World's Fair in 1939-40 for the International Tourism Campaign, which was titled Orient Calls. But to just go back for a minute, I did mention that I start out with the first chapter on the professionalization of design, which was forged in institutions and in discourse, particularly in mass media publishing. And I do think it's really important to underscore the importance of publishing and how key experts discursively constructed a status for the design field. And we know these individuals because we can see them actively advocating through these publications for the status of advertising design. They were naming it, defining it, creating programs to train in it, exhibiting it like art, and publishing a wide for manufacturers and retails. I just show you some of the trade journals, important uh, commercial publications that were the venues for this. And they were connected, most importantly, connected to a global community through trade journals and international exhibitions. So mass media was both an advertising medium and a mode of global communication for advertising design as a profession. I also mentioned that one of the most interesting and unique aspects of Japanese design is its creative use of scripts and characters because of its polyglot nature, having two syllabaries, Japanese kanji, romanization, all of these different kinds of ways of writing. And language and visualizing language was such a major issue that I really felt that it needed to have an entire chapter devoted to it. And this is both machine typography, but also hand designed letter forms across different marketing sectors. And I try to demonstrate how visible language communicates through form as well as content. And when I say visible language, I mean, in this case, how advertisers design the actual form of letters and words to communicate ideas. And it's a kind of visual choreography that you find, just showing you two example pages from a compendium here. There are many of them, and I have some great examples of wordplay and that I can show in Q&A if people are interested in learning more. But I'll go to the specific markets here. And as you can tell from health and beauty, the two companies I cover are Kao Soap and Shiseido Cosmetics. And this section really shows from the get-go how design was a reforming and disciplining impulse, which also offered bodily enhancements and pleasures through commodities. Design or good design was seen as helping people's lives. So hand washing here, and you see in this translated text on the advertisement with hand washing, an image of hand washing here, scholars say that the use of soap is a barometer of the culture of a first world nation. We understand that these rituals of cleanliness are part of a civilizational discourse. And in the middle, this is a magazine, an internal public relations magazine from Kao Soap, Kao Bulletin, which shows the young child showing her hands to her parents. I have washed my hands as a demonstration of that. Where Shiseido on the right, you're seeing another public relations magazine, Shiseido Graph, was selling cosmetics as part of a healthy new lifestyle for the new woman and the modern girl and everybody in between or beyond. So she's not only beautiful and fashionable, but she's active in all spheres. She imagines herself so, skiing stylishly down the slopes. And interestingly enough, here she's replicated almost like the commodity itself is on the assembly line. I was very fortunate to, in working in company archives, to have access to all of these public relations magazines to read what the companies were communicating to both to their chain stores internally within their marketing divisions and to their consumers. A very important kind of trade publication. Food and beverage, I mentioned Morinaga Confectionery Company and Calpis, which is a soft drink. And as I mentioned before, Morinaga proffered visions of sweets and conjuring up images of pleasure that were concentrated in that yellow box. And you can see this young girl surrounded by a halo of boxes here. But it's also important, the Morinaga example gives us a chance to really understand the importance of trademark design. And Japan had this long history of family and commercial crests, kamon or monsho, and the trademarks updated these crests and legalized them. The Morinaga trademark is an angel upside down holding the initials of Taichiro Morinaga, the founding president. And the reason they used angels was because the first product the company made were marshmallows, which were known as angel food. Also because children were seen as small angels, this community of angels. The image that you're seeing on the right is a very important poster that was chosen, designed by a German designer, Otto Dunkelsbühler, in an important global international competition that Calpis mounted to try to get a new logo and trademark. And they chose this particular image, a blackface image, which has continued to be used and was used up until the late 1980s. And it is such an interesting story. I think anyone who knows Calpis or knows Calpico, as it's marketed abroad, knows that it's a sweet fermented milk drink. It has a fantastic origin story with the president going to Mongolia to who discovers Mongolians drinking fermented yak milk and that it's good for the gut health. So this again is a product that straddles the line between health and treat and luxury and leisure as well. And it's delicious and refreshing, but nourishing and good for intestinal regulation, as the text will tell us. But I do have a whole section in the book about racialized design and talking about the importance of the use of blackface and black imagery, the kurombo imagery. This really was quite a craze in Japan and written about extensively about the appeal, yet not really taking into consideration the colonial and the denigrating aspects of blackface that were also traveling around the world. But there's also the global movement of jazz that was extremely popular in Japan. I'd love to talk about this more. One of the things that was very interesting to me is that we often associate Black imagery coming from the United States, but I would say for the design world, this kind of imagery came more via Germany, via German design. Dunkelbühler was German. Jazz was a global phenomenon, but also the Germans were deeply interested in Americanismus, and they were interested in all of the things coming from the United States, cowboys and all of these various kinds of things. So it's not just a one-to-one kind of conduit from the United States, but it's being mediated around the world, and of course by colonial imagery that's very much connected to products that are part of the imperial project of European countries that are producing and marketing things. And I also put this in conversation with racialized images of Asia that are kind of pinging back from the United States and other kinds of imageries here, as well as Japan's own colonies. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just show the images of light, labor, and leisure here. Who knew that the light bulb could be such an evocative motif? But light, as I mentioned, was a commodity and a medium. You can see in this question mark here that it's not only for work and productivity and for studying and for healthy eyes, but also for entertainment, for the Great White Way of Broadway, or for Asakusa and other places. And I concentrate on Matsushita, now Panasonic's national brand, on the left, and you see the light the light bulb here as the nighttime sun, which was often, it was light bulbs were often compared with the sun. In fact, Thomas Edison talked about the sun, and he felt that his creation, the light bulb, might eventually preclude the need for any sleep, that people might work 24 hours because it would produce a nighttime sun and you would never have to go to sleep. And of course, we're kind of living that dystopian reality right now. Um, Many people know that in my previous book, Gas Mask Nation, I centered on the role of advertising and visual culture in the militarization of Japan through World War II, specifically the visualization of civil air defense. And I pick up these questions again in my chapter on nation and empire, but I particularly focus on tourism campaigns and also in the selling of nation and empire, both selling in terms of trying to bring tourists to Japan, but also selling Japanese culture abroad as a kind of diplomacy to assuage all of the various political turmoil that was taking place after Japan's um, annexation and invasion of Manchuria, North China in 1931-32. And we see a kind of creating of a logo body in the word for Japan, or a geomorphing of the sun into a kind of geo body of Manchuria and the empire here. And it is really important to understand that the Japanese colonies were marketed as a kind of key part of Imperial Japan's industrial dynamism for the future. And we see that through a lot of the publicity and propaganda of the 1930s. And although there's undoubtedly a shift in 1937 with the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, publicity and advertising do not disappear. They just get nested and more embedded within propaganda. And I think that's a really important thing that I've discussed in relation to Nippon Kobo, the studio that worked throughout the war from 1934 to 1945, and some of the amazing, very modernist publications that they created, which merged national and international, native tradition and global modernity. And the reason I mention these designers is particularly because this group of people was directly engaged in the designs for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. These are people who, as I mentioned with Hara Hiromu, became the pioneers and titans of the post-war design world. As I said, design continued during the war. But I'll just end with my trans-war section here. One thing that I did not know until I started this research was how important design was as part of the cultural diplomacy of restoring Japan's identity as a normal, peaceful nation after the war. And it was very important that Tokyo and many of these designers hosted the World Design Conference in 1960. Over 200 of the world's most famous designers and architects came to Tokyo to discuss design in the service of mankind. And so this was incredibly important for Japan's return to the World Theater of Nations. And I just show you on the right, Kono Takashi, who worked for Nippon Kobo, designed the logo for the World Design Conference. And you see the C and the D for design conference here, but they're nestled within the character for Nihon or Nippon, Japan. And part of my argument about the trans-war continuities is this relationship between nationalism and internationalism, that they're actually complementary, and we see them together. And the best example of that is the hidden trans-war continuities of the Tokyo Olympics from 1964. The logo was designed by Kamekura Yusaku. He did the posters. We have these famous pictograms that transcend individual languages and legibility. This design program became paradigmatic for Olympic design from that time forward. It's considered one of the great peaks of designing a mega event, and everything was designed. And part of the reveal of the book is that Japan, many people don't know, was actually slated to host the Olympics in 1940. It won the bid in 1936, but this is now known as the Phantom Olympics because it never happened. It was canceled in 1938 due to wartime exigencies. And if we go back and we look at the designs that were imagined for 1940, we see so many of the same people and the same ideas and an updating of the design programs in the Olympic designs for 1964. And I do think this really, not only do we see the same companies and the same designers, but we also see the same connection between the corporate, the national, the cultural, and it goes a long way in explaining the post-war economic miracle. So I'll stop here and happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you. Oh, there's more. Do you want to stop the sharing
Oh,
some
yes, I was just
pages
going to
or
say
leave
that
it
the
on?
pictograms, we also see examples of the pictograms, thinking about ways to create these pictograms in 1936 by Tadahoku, who was also a really important designer, designed many of the posters for Kirin beer. Okay,
Very
so
interesting.
let's end with that.
So there's so much happening. I have so many questions. I don't want to crowd out the Q&A. The questions are coming in, but I want to thank you, Gennifer, for finally explaining to me where the word Dentsu came from. Because I've always wondered what kind of name is Dentsu for an advertising agency? And as you explain in your book, it is a company founded by one of the designers, the early designers, and in 1901, and he founded the Nihon Kokoku Kabushiki Gaisha, and that had a telegraphic wire service that came with it, and that was a Dempo Tsushin.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that became Dentsu, the largest advertising company in the world, as far as I know. So really amazing. Thank you for teaching me a business thing. That's really good. So the question that came to me as I was reading through your book is, this is all great, and I'm not sure it's a fair question. I know you're a Japan expert, and so am I, but but nevertheless. How is Japan different? And so with that I mean, wouldn't the same have happened in Germany? And you actually mentioned the German designer who inspired and the black-faced,
Mhm.
head. And indeed, there's a question from the audience that asks the same question in a better way, I guess. Could you say Japan was well ahead of Madison Avenue?
Well, they were definitely in real time in conversation with Madison Avenue. And I think that's the difference in this approach, which is not thinking of it as this very latent node that was just either copying or just basically nothing innovative happening during this time period, but actually real-time conversations. We see that in the trade journals. For instance, you mentioned Germany. There's a really important trade journal, Gebrauchsgrafik, published over several decades, and we see Advertising World, which is an important, and Affiche, and some of the journals, the trade journals that I cover, are in real-time conversations where it's not just one-to-one. It's Germany, it's Britain, it's France, it's sometimes Russian design. If you think about Soviet design being so interesting, basically the world is in conversation during this time, and there's this kind of global media highway, and trade journals really reveal that. Not to mention exhibitions. The Japanese were being selected. They were quite the hit in 1937 World's Fair in Paris, which led to a big poster exhibition. There was a really important impresario, Satomi Munetsugu, who was going back and forth. He worked in Paris, but he also was a good kind of interlocutor between the two countries. So I think the real question here is not to single Japan out. It was never in isolation. It was always embedded in a global sphere, always in conversation. And what makes it unique is really the historical, social, cultural distinctiveness, as Germany and Italy were, of being a late forming nation state. We have proto-capitalism in the Tokugawa period. We see some of the advertising forms there for sure. But there's all ways in which these things kind of take their own form. I mean, anybody who goes to Japan now knows that that department stores are quite distinctive in Japan as cultural hubs, or of character goods, or of the kinds of very elaborate cosmetics, worlds of Shiseido, the world of the parlor that they create. There's any number of ways that we could tease out what's distinctive here, but I think what we need to do is not think in trans-historical, essentializing ways, but think about it more in terms of actual company developments and actual historicized products.
Yeah, and we should remind ourselves that this recent globalization thing that we had going was actually the second time that we had a globalized world. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that, if I could choose a place and time to go back in time and choose a place and time to live, I would want to live in Taisho, Japan, and because it was very, very. You spent some time talking about the word design
Mhm.
and the Zuan. And I thought that that was really interesting. Where did the word design come from? And then it ended up as design as the katakana. And I'm always a little nervous about katakana words because they kind of signal that it's something that gaijin do,
Mhm.
right? And but so how did they get from Zuan to design, or where did the design come from in the first place?
Well, I think one of the things that I try to make clear is that there's a kind of full lexicon, and it's not a stable sense of what design means. To some people, design means architecture, or industrial design. I try to follow the etymology of these different terms. And so early on, we have kata or forms that are patterns that come in kimono books or other types of decorative arts. Then we get the idea of isho, which is a kind of is it the earliest idea of design or decorative Soshoku Isho decorative design. But the term Zuan is the earliest translation of the term design as experienced through the works in world expositions around the 1870s and the Vienna World Exposition. And even the characters for Zuan changed slightly over time. I mentioned that the hand radical is removed so that it's not just a kind of mechanical type of activity. And people see that as moving kind of to the world of ideas from the world of the hand or handicrafts. But koge, the term koge, which we think of as crafts, was in many ways the term for design early on too. So when people talk about sangyo koge, they're really talking about industrial design as well, or koge bijutsu, industrial arts. It's very much a melange, and of course, so much of advertising design is senden bijutsu, kokoku bijutsu, using advertising. But I was really taken with the work of one particular theorist of design early on who coined the term shogyo bijutsu, which is a direct translation of the English word commercial art. And he was very vocal advocate for the use of the term commercial art, and that art be in there, the idea of bijutsu. Bijutsu is a neologism to begin with because early modern Japan doesn't separate out the fine arts from the decorative arts or other forms of arts, calligraphy and other things. So it's a really complicated story to tease apart, and others have written about this. But I do think it's important to understand that these are contested terms, and the whole idea of creating a field requires the creation of a new language. The term design, which was used, you know, basically contemporaneously in Euro America, really is a post-war, much more used in the 1950s as design. The katakana word design. In the pre-war period, it's really much more Zuan, Isho, Soshoku Isho, or Shogyo Bijutsu.
So one portion of the book is about this nation building through this commercial art. And I'm completely, fascinated by all of this. And yeah, so and then you you create a sort of a sense of Japaneseness around the soap or whatever, and it's upgrading, and we now wash our hands, so we're a first world country and all that. But so I mean, and that's fascinating. And then of course it's used more for colonial purposes also, right? So there's Taiwan, there's Korea, Manchukuo. How is that? Is there any difference in what Japan did at the time from, let's say, what the Germans did or the French in using commerce and commercial design to, create this image of the forward-looking country or something? Is there anything special about Japan that you found?
I would just say that the amount of complementarity between corporate and industrial development and the state and imperialism is perhaps more in sync and more pronounced than you might see it. And I have a colleague here who works a lot on modern Germany, and he would say that yes, of course, you have some German corporations and you're designing for corporations, but it's not in this complementary relationship with the state the way that the Japanese example is. That's not to say that these weren't private corporations that were interested in profits. And they were interested in brand identity. They were deeply embedded in these consumer markets, but they definitely thought that their products would have benefits, and they tried to sell the benefits and sell the behaviors and construct the behaviors that would make their products more useful and more necessary. What you have to understand about brand name goods is they're more expensive than generic goods. There was generic soap. You could find soap. It was a rougher, less refined form of soap. But why would you pay extra to buy cow soap? You would do that because you have the affective and the aesthetic surplus of advertising that makes it a desirable commodity. It takes a generic good and makes it a desirable commodity. It also makes the production itself something consistent. The idea of reliable sudsing, of being 99% pure, 99.4% pure, which Kao took directly from Procter and Gamble's Ivory soap. There's a lot of ways in which this is really key to creating these national brands. Most goods were local and regional before that. They were generic goods, and people were more focused on the merchant than they were on the manufacturer of things. So this kind of focuses more on the manufacturer identity, and then the brand identity is absolutely crucial to that. But there's no reason why you shouldn't be, if you're Lion Dentrifice, you're Lion Hamigaki, people need to brush their teeth. So you create uh, different schedules for children to brush their teeth, and you do these big mass game exercises where all children are at school brushing their teeth in unison, and then you give them really fun giveaways and all of the different promotions so they can keep track of when they brush their teeth. And on the back might have a fun character or some other type of fun thing like a baseball statistics, or it might be a bookmark or something that you could reuse in your daily life. So there's just this real innovative use of marketing, and again, in all of these different modalities. And I just have one article but from advertising world that I shows all of the different types of ways in which advertising design can infiltrate your daily life, everything down to scented tissues and various kinds of various things. So,
But
I hope
of
that
course,
answers your
there's
question.
a sorry, there's of course the aspect of the of status, right? So you can afford so we have a bunch of questions, and one you partially just answered, I think, but let me read it out. Could you tell us a story behind the title Persuasion?
Yes.
Something more than publicity or propaganda. And how was it received by the public? Were they persuaded? And so you partially just answered that, but
Yes, yes. I mean, part of it is, the idea of in advertising that it's the art of persuasion. And so thinking of it in conjunction with fine art and all of the movements of artistic modernism, whether it's Bauhausian modernism, Art Nouveau, Art Deco was really important. But ultimately, as I mentioned with brand name goods, you're trying to convince people to buy things. And I like the kind of duality of the idea of persuasion, which is that it's both compelling people and then it's making things enticing, their commodity enticements, but also disciplining them and reforming their behaviors, persuading them in other ways. And Benjamin writes about how the Frankfurt School writes a lot about this idea about how advertising commodities create a veil around this activity of persuasion. So I sort of took it from some of that discourse, but I also felt that it had a nice ring to it to think about the way we think about advertising as a field itself.
We have a comment, fantastic presentation, it says, and you've answered many questions, and how, so a lot of what you talk about resembles Soviet and German modernisms. And the question is, was there an institute analogous to the USSR's, whatever that thing was? I can't even pronounce it, or Bauhaus in Germany. So did the Japanese get organized around this in some way, shape, or form?
Nothing on that scale, but there was an institute that Kamekura Yusaku actually went to that was modeled on the Bauhaus, which was this idea, a little going all the way back to the Werkbund idea of all of the arts being taught in one place, whether it was architecture or product design or graphics and Bauhaus design, particularly for Kamekura, Bauhaus editorial design and typography were taught there, and that was very important for him. But there were many different new design programs and schools that were established during this time period within major universities, including Geidai, which is, the Tokyo University of Fine Arts, during this time. And so we see a gradual legitimation of design in all its spheres. And like I said, decorative arts are a big part of that as well. You can't tease apart design from decorative arts during this time period, and they are actively sponsored like crafts through world expositions and other places as an important kind of export ware to show Japan's culture, but also for raising capital as well. So that's extremely important. But we do have institutes that are researching design for the through the government, the Koge Shido Show, which published a magazine, Koge News, was studying design, mostly industrial design during this time. It's actually a complicated question about the schools because I would say that actually it's in these in-house corporate advertising divisions that people are really honing their skills. And many people referred to Morinaga as an advertising school.
And
Coca-Cola.
and to this day, right? To this day, we have training in R&D labs of the engineers. So that actually continues. Okay, one last question. And then unfortunately time is up, but this is going to be a good one. And I'm combining two. The question is, the first part of the question is whether Japan's long relationship with paper and traditional art and home decor positioned Japan naturally as an expert in commercial art and packaging. And related, former student of mine asks whether something about the customer as kami-sama
Mm.
plays into this. That is to say, the sophisticated customer, very demanding, wants to get nice wrapping and that sort of thing, and whether that actually kind of pushed forward this industry.
I definitely think that longstanding craft traditions and aestheticized objects are an important substrate for thinking about design here. And certainly Kamekura Yusaku, when he wrote about the long history of design, that Japan was, in a sense, traditional Japan was modern before the modernity. And there's a lot of that discourse coming out later in the time period from the 30s through the 60s about how Japan was modern before modernity in its traditional design. And therefore, it was uniquely equipped. And he used the term katachi. It didn't really take hold. It didn't have the stickiness factor of ma or some of the other wabi sabi or any of the other aesthetic terms that get picked up. But in terms of the Japanese consumer, yes, there's a lot of respect for the consumer and a lot of respect for companies, and this idea of quality assurance that you would produce high quality goods for consumption, and yes, discerning consumers, but that the Japanese consumer deserved good things, and that was an obligation of the company to do that, to produce good quality things.
And to make it pretty.
Yes, and to make it aesthetically and emotionally appealing. The affective aspect of advertising is really important, that it's something safe and reliable, of good quality, safe for your children, not going to hurt your eyes. Those kinds of things are really important, and they make brand name goods more reliable. And that's why identifying a brand name good in the marketplace ensures that. It ensures that quality experience.
Well, then that continues, right? So once you have that brand name, in order to continue it, you have to keep doing what you're doing, including wrapping the paper bag in which you sell something in plastic on a rainy day. To
Yes.
this day, this is just so heartwarming to buy something in Japan and take good care of the customer kind of thing. All right, let me take good care of my speaker here. It's the hour is over, and it went by in no time. Thank you, Gennifer Weisenfeld from Duke, to be with me here today. And thanks, audience, for joining us. I will keep you posted on our upcoming events. We'll maybe go into the summer, but I promise I will do some things over the summer. So I'll see you again soon. And Gennifer, thank you again for joining us here today.
Very much, Ulrika. Lovely to see you.
Take good care.